Hello, this is Jonathan Gernon, and this will be my presentation for the Private versus Public Sector Week 4 project. The two agencies that we're going to be comparing with each other are law enforcement and private security. Both have similar missions in that they wish to maintain the peace in a designated area and look to respond when bad things happen. Graham Allison takes some time to respond to the question if the private and public sectors are alike in all unimportant respects. And while we're looking at if something is alike in all unimportant respects, we must also look at if they are unalike in all important respects. There is a distinction because if we're simply saying that they're alike in all unimportant respects, they could also be alike in all important respects as well. And I feel that public and private security are not only alike in all unimportant respects, but unalike in all important respects. The three themes that we're going to use in order to show that the private security and public law enforcement are alike in all unimportant respects and unalike in all important respects is going to be looking at this in the way that we would be looking at the lifespan of a home. The first thing that we need to do is we need to have a foundation for the home. In that foundation, we're going to be taking a look at everything that came first to establish public administration, to create the bureaucracies that allowed law enforcement to exist, and how those compare to the private sector. The next is we need to refine the home. We're going to add more detail, paint, all the little details, everything that we need, framing, all that good stuff. And for that, we're going to be taking a look at how the day-to-day operations have kind of been expanded upon through the different theories. Finally, we're going to look at the lifespan of the home and what would cause it to eventually fail. In this case, we're going to be looking at law enforcement, how it's been developed, where it needs to go, and how it keeps from falling into a state of decay, and what would cause it to eventually fail. Alright, so first off we're going to start off with the foundation. And what better way to start off with the foundation than when we're going to be looking at the Constitution. Now the Constitution, the two that we're going to really be looking at is Article 1 and Article 2. Article 1 of the Constitution creates the legislative branch. The House of Representatives, the Senate, gives them power to create laws, and importantly, the power of the purse. That does become important as it is one of the checks and balances on the executive branch. The executive branch of the government is created in order to execute what is proposed by the legislative branch. Now, within this, there's a bit of play in it, as in the Article 1, they create laws. Laws are very usually pretty general. The executive branch is then left up to interpret those laws and how to enforce, regulate, things of that nature. So the legislative branch can simply say, hey, we want to make a law that, let's say, police need to be more gentle with things. Article 2, our executive branch, is going to come along and say, okay, more gentle with things. So let's take away tasers. They're not allowed to use tasers anymore. Just saying. So the executive branch can really refine what the legislative branch has said. So this is important because it's the foundation of the bureaucracy. It's the foundation of the interpretation of the laws and creating a system that's going to enforce and go out and actually implement what the legislative branch has said. Now, the system, though, that it created was the system of spoils. To the victor go the spoils. So with the spoil system, basically every president, every elected official that came along would bring in his own crew of people. And now this even extended out into law enforcement. You'd be appointed a police chief. The police chief would then hire people from his neighborhood, his friends, things like that, to be captains, lieutenants, sergeants, officers, and really it created this whole spoil system. Well, then came along the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act of 1883 said, you know what? We're going to turn that administrative job into a career. We're going to go ahead and separate those out. So now instead of to the victor go the spoils, now we're going to have a career in public administration. So after that, shortly after that, Wilson came up with his dichotomy. Now, the way that this is a dichotomy is that Wilson looked at this and the idea that the administration was always present. It had always been there. It's, you know, it's not part of the politics or even part of the constitutional studies, as he put it. It's looking at everything on how it should be properly applicated. So it wasn't more of a creating something new, it was more of a welcome letter to the administration saying, congratulations, now you have a permanent job. And with that, he also talked about how we still need to be sensitive to the public opinion. Now, being sensitive to the public opinion, it's very, very evident in law enforcement. You can think back to the war on crime and how the police were expected to be treating people. And now we've gotten into a new world where we're talking about mental health help, and we're talking about how the Black Lives Matter movement, things like that, and how the police are expected to treat and how the police are expected to carry out their duties. So from there, we move on to Max Weber. Now, Max Weber had what he defined as his 6 characteristics of bureaucracy. Within that, he stated that there should be a hierarchy of command. The police agency definitely has a hierarchy of command, so you can see where we're developing this public law enforcement figure. So it also talked about formal rules, regulations, and things of that nature. Every department has a department manual on how everything should be done. It's all written down. We're constantly adjusting and going through different things in order to stay current, and we're writing all of those down too. So now that we have our foundation built, we move on to the refining process and how things are going to be refined for the public administration. The first person to come along to really kind of refine things without knowing about it would be Taylor. Taylor was very about efficiency. As we know, he could take create an assembly line, break up big tasks into small tasks. He wasn't always everybody's favorite in regards to the workforces. Bosses would be constantly standing over people with stopwatches, timing their every movement, and eventually it was all about efficiency. Well, as anybody knows that has gone through an efficient process, it's very enjoyable. And people like things that are enjoyable. So efficiency not only became part of public administration, but It actually became one of the pillars of public administration. Now, why? Well, that goes on back over to what we were talking about with our dichotomy, in that we need to be sensitive to the public opinion. When we're listening to the public, we get an idea of what the public wants, and we're able to interpret that into our public administration. So moving on from there, we had Fayol. Now Fayol really built off of Taylor, and he was a predecessor to Weber, but a lot of the things go hand in hand, and he would further refine things. One of the things he's talking about is unity of command and his unity of direction. Management needs to be on the same page, doing the same thing, leading people in the same way. Again, that comes back to the hierarchy and talking about, low rank to high rank, everybody knows where everybody's at. So along with that, there needs to be a commitment and a spirit de corps. Now this commitment is important as well, as it creates more consistent employees, less turnover rates, and you guessed it, it's more efficient. If we have the same people doing the same tasks all the time, definitely gets easier, it becomes more efficient, just like we were talking about with Taylor. Now, Fayol is interesting because he again never entered into the public sector. He was actually part of a French mining company. Now, as part of that French mining company, he was really just very focused on the technical side of things, financial side of things, talking about protection, security, and then his managerial area, getting the ideas of the stability of tenure. We're talking about the authority. So you can see how this was again a private sector thing that was brought over into the public sector, and how this really became a tenet of public administration. It really refined our day-to-day operations as they would be. Now, when we're talking about law enforcement can't just be RoboCop. So as part of our day-to-day operations, we need a little bit something different, and that's where Follett will come in, and she'll refine us just a little bit more, and not so much talking in this general sense of management and employees, so like sergeant and deputy, but talking about when we're dealing with the public. Law enforcement is going to act as like a leader to the public, and this is the development of the kind of the community-oriented police modeling that a lot of agencies follow, where we're going to be working with the public instead of having power over the public. And that's the idea of the reciprocal relationships, where if we work together with the public, it's easier to lead them and easier to solve problems. So finally we get to the idea of the lifespan of the house. How long is this house going to last? Well, the first thing that we can look at is we can look at the life cycles of bureaucracies, of bureaus, that Downes looks at. Now, to start off with, he looks at the creation of things. Now, the creation of this is the idea of a needs. There's a need for law enforcement. So it's one of those agencies that are created based off a need. Now, the growth and the decline of this agency is going to be based off of the externalities. So again, going back to that whole concept of being able to listen to public opinion and talk about the externalities. And again, we're looking at the idea of efficiency coming back in from Taylor, that can a private sector do it more efficiently than a public sector? Now, one of the things about a bureaucracy is that it does get better with time. as things move on, people become more skilled and people become better at their job. This again comes back to the idea of Fayol talking about his tenure and keeping people around. Now, when an agency is going to essentially die, this is when they're failing to perform the function that they were created for, or that possibly another agency or another person has come along that can do it better. So one of the things that they'll do not to die is to absorb more. Now this is very prevalent in law enforcement, as things started off very basic for law enforcement. They were simply handling laws and the sense of a criminal aspect. Since then, traffic enforcement has been added to them, dealing with the mentally ill has been added to them, dealing with the homeless, lifestyle situations, all kinds of things have been added to law enforcement's job. And it has made it more difficult for law enforcement, but at the same time it has definitely kept law enforcement prevalent within public administration and the general public of the United States, and has really allowed for law enforcement to continue to thrive. Now, what brings about all of those changes that I was talking about? Well, that can be attributed back to the idea of incrementalism, that things change slowly, a little bit at a time. So, a need for a law, a need for something is found. And going back to our legislative branch, a law is created. The executive branch then interprets it, and it gets passed on eventually to the deputies, the line officers. So the laws will change just a little bit at a time, just to keep the job just changing just a little bit at a time, keep adding more, keep things relevant, keep things where they need to be in order to keep the law enforcement profession alive. So that brings on the idea of the end of the life cycle that we were talking about. When does an agency die? Well, in law enforcement, we will usually have an agency die when we're talking about a city that runs out of money, and then law enforcement services get transferred over to the county. But there's still law enforcement there. Now, one of the things that we look at is we look at the idea of a wicked problem, one best way. So, is there a way that it's being done better? We can look at private security. Now, private security is going to be looking at things in the idea of money, profit. So, is it more profitable to have private law enforcement, for somebody to pay to have law enforcement near them? Or will this create a system where not everyone will receive the services that they need? Alright, welcome to the conclusion. We're going to wrap things up here and kind of put a little bow on this one. So, going back to our question of, are things alike in all unimportant respects, or unalike in all important respects between public law enforcement and private security? Private security is there. Private security is there to make a profit. Whoever's going to be able to pay them is going to be the people that are going to be protected by them. So you can see that most of the time when you have private security, they're usually alongside famous people, or they are part of corporations. It is very unlikely that a normal person would be able to receive these services of private security. While it would make it safer to have a security guard at every single house 24 hours a day, it's not practical, as people can't pay for those types of services. So that's where, again, it's a wicked problem. we come back to the idea that law enforcement should be a public service, paid for by taxes and not charged to the people. When we look back at how things have turned out, are they alike, are they unalike? Well, we look at law enforcement being established back at the beginning of our country when we established public administration, and that it has evolved with time and is consistent with all of these different theories that we've been talking about. Law enforcement has to be efficient. Law enforcement has to have a hierarchy of command. Law enforcement has to follow the rules and regulations. Law enforcement changes incrementally over time. These are all things that really are true to the way that law enforcement works, while private security is a business. The lifespan of the business is going to be as long as somebody wants to create one, and when that company eventually goes bankrupt. So, with that, I do believe that they are alike in all unimportant respects and unalike in all important respects. And I do believe that they should stay that way. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments.